Imagine waking up without an alarm, no phone buzzing on the nightstand, no traffic sounds filtering through the window, no schedule to check, no emails waiting, no meetings to prepare for. Instead, you open your eyes to the soft grey light of dawn, filtering through narrow stone slits high in a thick wall. The air carries only the faint scent of damp earth and beeswax, broken now and then by the distant measured toll of a single bell calling the community to prayer. Outside those walls, the medieval world churned with uncertainty. Raids along borderlands, disputes over fields and titles, waves of illness that swept through crowded villages without warning, and the constant scramble for enough food to last the winter. Yet within the enclosure, time moved differently, ordered by rhythm rather than urgency, offering a rare pocket of stillness amid the wider turbulence. That contrast is what first draws us into the secret life of medieval monasteries. While the lands beyond often felt unpredictable and harsh, the monastery presented itself as a deliberate haven, a place where the clamour of daily survival gave way to something quieter and more intentional. People from every corner of society felt its pull. Some sought refuge from the endless cycle of conflict and loss that marked the era. Others arrived seeking a deeper sense of purpose, drawn by the promise of lives devoted to reflection, rather than the scramble for land or favour. A few came simply because the walls offered safety and regular meals when the wider countryside could provide neither. Whatever the individual reason, the choice carried weight, for stepping behind those walls meant leaving one existence behind and entering another governed by shared purpose and gentle repetition. As we begin this journey together, I invite you to settle in and let the pace slow. Perhaps you might share in the comments where you are listening from right now, what time it is there in your location, so we can picture this calm unfolding across different parts of the world at once. Your presence here connects us, much as the monasteries once connected scattered communities through letters, prayers, and the steady exchange of knowledge. What awaits inside those walls is more than simple quiet. We will discover how the earliest communities formed in remote places, how ordinary men and women chose this path amid countless other possibilities, and how each day unfolded in a careful balance of prayer, work, and rest. We will walk through the hours of the night when the bells rang even in darkness, explore the architecture that shaped sacred space, and glimpse the hidden labour of scriptoriums where books were crafted by hand, gardens and farms that sustained entire houses, infirmaries that cared for the sick, and libraries that preserved learning through uncertain centuries will all come into view. We will consider the kitchens and dining halls, the shifting balance of wealth and influence, the parallel stories of women's communities, and the long arc that led to decline and eventual dissolution. Through it all, the tone remains one of gentle immersion, allowing the details to unfold at their own measured pace. The promise is not merely to list facts, but to sense what it might have felt like to live inside that world, to feel the cool stone underfoot at midnight, to hear the scratch of a quill in a sunlit corner, to taste bread baked from grain grown within the same enclosure. Such glimpses remind us that the monastery was never simply an escape. It was an active experiment in living differently, one that shaped the surrounding culture even as it stood apart from it. Curiosity naturally arises here. How did such places begin in the first place, and what kept them steady through centuries of change? Those questions will guide us forward, each answer opening another quiet doorway. For now, let the contrast linger. Outside, a traveller on the road might hear the clash of distant arms or the anxious murmur of a market unsure of tomorrow's supply. Inside, the same hour might find a monk or nun pausing between tasks to watch light shift across a cloister garth. The only sounds the rustle of robes and the trickle of a fountain. That difference is what continues to fascinate, inviting us to step across the threshold and explore the ordered world that once existed behind monastery walls. Long before the first stone was laid in the cloisters of northern Europe, the impulse towards such ordered stillness had already taken root in far more arid and solitary ground. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, as the Roman world shifted under waves of political upheaval and spiritual searching, small groups of men and women began slipping away from cities and villages alike. They moved into the deserts of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, places where the horizon offered little shelter and the sun stripped away every distraction. These desert fathers and mothers, as later generations would call them, sought not escape in the modern sense but a direct confrontation with the self through silence, fasting, and unceasing prayer. Stories filtered back of Antony the Great standing motionless for days in his cave, of Pachomius organising loose gatherings of hermits into the first tentative communities, and of countless unnamed seekers who carried only a cloak, a water-skin, and the conviction that true clarity lay beyond the clamour of ordinary life. Their choices were extreme, often solitary, and shaped by the particular harshness of desert landscapes, yet they planted the earlier seeds of what would become monasticism. The radical idea that deliberate withdrawal could open a path to something deeper than survival. Centuries later, that same impulse travelled north and encountered a very different climate, both literal and cultural. In the early 6th century, a young Italian named Benedict of Nursia found himself drawn to the same pattern of withdrawal, first retreating to a cave above Subiaco, and then, almost reluctantly, becoming a guide for others who arrived seeking his counsel. What emerged from his experience was not another set of harsh austerities, but a written rule that balanced prayer, manual labour, sacred reading, and communal stability in ways that felt quietly revolutionary. The rule of St. Benedict emphasised moderation over heroic extremes, insisting that monks remain in one place for life, that they share meals and work together, and that authority rest with an abbot chosen for wisdom rather than force. This framework transformed the solitary desert impulse into something durable enough to take root in the damp forests and river valleys of Europe. Where earlier experiments had often dissolved under isolation or severity, Benedict's approach offered a rhythm that could be sustained across seasons and generations, turning the monastery into a living organism rather than a temporary refuge. From Italy the pattern spread, carried by travellers who carried copies of the rule along with their few belongings. Irish monks established remote outposts on rocky islands and in forested glens, adapting the hours of prayer to the longer northern twilights. Missionaries from Rome and Gaul moved into Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, founding houses that soon dotted the landscape from Kent to Northumbria. In Francia and beyond the Alps, rulers granted land and protection, sometimes out of genuine devotion, and sometimes in hopes of stabilizing frontier regions through settled communities. Each new foundation carried the same core rhythm yet bent slightly to local conditions. Vineyards in warmer valleys, sheepfolds on windswept hills, scriptoriums warmed by peat fires where Latin texts were copied beside vernacular prayers. The movement grew not through conquest but through quiet persistence, each house becoming a node in an invisible web that linked distant regions through letters, shared saints' days, and the steady exchange of manuscripts. What drew so many to this life across the medieval centuries remains a question that invites lingering reflection rather than simple answers. In an age when harvest could fail, borders shift overnight, and illness arrive without warning, the monastery offered a visible alternative to constant uncertainty. Its walls promised not only physical safety, but a daily structure that freed the mind from endless calculation about tomorrow's bread or tonight's shelter. For some, the appeal lay in the chance to preserve and transmit learning at a time when few other institutions could do so reliably. For others, the steady alternation of prayer and work answered a deeper hunger for meaning that village life or court service rarely satisfied. And for still more, the simple fact of belonging to a community bound by vows rather than blood or coin created a sense of continuity stronger than the fragile ties of the world outside. None of these motives existed in isolation, and individuals arrived with mixtures of devotion, necessity, and curiosity that no single chronicle can fully capture. Yet the endurance of the model across centuries suggests that the promise of ordered calm, once glimpsed, continued to exert a quiet gravitational pull even on those who never stepped inside the enclosure themselves. As these early patterns settled into the landscape, the monastery began to appear less like an imported idea and more like a natural feature of the medieval world, its bells marking time for travellers on distant roads, and its gardens supplying food and medicines to surrounding hamlets. The questions of origin give way then to the lived reality that followed, how the hours were kept, how the spaces were shaped, and how ordinary days unfolded within the rhythm Benedict's rule had made possible. Yet before those hours could unfold in their measured cadence, there remained the quiet threshold question of who would choose, or find themselves chosen for, the life that waited inside. Medieval monasteries drew from every layer of society, though never in equal measure or with uniform intent. Sons of minor nobility often arrived with a portion of family land attached to their entry, a transaction that secured both spiritual merit for the kin and a measure of influence within the house itself. Peasant families, facing land scarcity or the threat of famine, sometimes presented a younger child as an oblate, a living gift whose labour and prayers might ease the household's burden while guaranteeing the child a measure of security the fields could not. Widows and widowers, their worldly ties severed by loss, occasionally sought the enclosure as a place where grief might be shaped into something steadier than private mourning, and among the most intriguing arrivals were those whose paths were shaped less by personal conviction than by political calculation. Younger sons whose inheritance had already been claimed by an elder brother, or daughters whose marriage prospects had collapsed amid shifting alliances, found the cloister offered a respectable alternative to landlessness or dependence. The formal commitment that awaited each newcomer rested on 3 or 4 interlocking vows, whose precise wording varied by order, yet whose core demands remained remarkably consistent across centuries. Poverty required the surrender of personal possessions, though the precise boundary between communal goods and individual use invited constant interpretation and occasional quiet resistance. Chastity bound the monk or nun to celibacy, a vow whose observance was understood not merely as bodily restraint, but as a redirection of affection toward the community and the divine. Obedience placed the individual under the authority of the abbot or abbess, whose decisions carried the weight of spiritual guidance rather than mere administrative command. In many houses, a 4th promise of stability anchored the monk to that single community for life, discouraging the wandering that earlier desert traditions had sometimes permitted. These vows were spoken not in a single dramatic moment, but after a prolonged period of testing, whose length and rigour were designed to reveal whether the candidate's initial impulse could survive the slow abrasion of daily repetition. That testing period, known as the novitiate, typically spanned 1 or 2 years and unfolded as a deliberate apprenticeship in both the outer and inner disciplines of the house. Novices rose at the same hours as the professed monks, yet slept in a separate dormitory, where an older monk served as master of novices, guiding them through the memorization of the rule, the memorization of psalms, and the small repeated acts of self-denial that would later become instinctive. They learned to keep silence during meals, to walk with lowered eyes in the cloister, and to accept correction without visible resentment. The novitiate was not intended as a simple trial of endurance, but as a gradual reshaping of perception, an education in noticing the subtle textures of communal life that the outside world rarely cultivated. Only after this formation did the novice stand before the assembled community to request profession, an act that required the unanimous consent of the chapter and carried the understanding that the decision, once made, was meant to be irrevocable. Yet the historical record makes clear that not every entrant arrived with equal measures of willingness. Child oblates, dedicated by their parents before they could speak for themselves, sometimes grew into adults who experienced the monastery as both shelter and constraint, their later letters or chronicles occasionally revealing a quiet ambivalence toward the path chosen on their behalf. Political placements could produce similar tensions. A noble youth sent to neutralize a dynastic threat might comply outwardly, while inwardly calculating the moment when escape or advancement elsewhere might become possible. Even among adult volunteers, motives often braided together strands of genuine spiritual longing with more pragmatic considerations such as access to learning, protection from conscription, or the simple fact that a monastic community could offer regular meals when villages faced harvest failure. The rule itself acknowledged this mixture by requiring that novices be reminded repeatedly of the hardships ahead, as if to sift genuine commitment from temporary enthusiasm or external pressure. What remains striking is how these varied entrances nevertheless fed into a single, shared rhythm once the vows were spoken. The reluctant oblate and the fervent seeker alike learned to move through the same sequence of offices, to labour in the same fields, and to accept the same limitations on speech and movement. Over time, the distinction between willing and unwilling could blur, as the daily structure itself began to shape desire rather than merely constrain it. Some who entered under duress discovered within the enclosure a form of freedom they had not anticipated, while others who arrived with ardent devotion found the reality more ordinary, and therefore more demanding than their imaginings had allowed. The monastery absorbed both temperaments, its longevity depending less on uniform zeal than on the capacity of the rule to accommodate the full spectrum of human motive without collapsing into either rigid idealism or mere habit. This gradual integration of disparate arrivals also shaped the internal character of each house, in ways that no single founder could have fully predicted. A community that received many child oblates might develop a stronger emphasis on schooling and manuscript work, while one enriched by adult converts from court circles might cultivate more elaborate liturgical music or diplomatic correspondence. The vows remained the same, yet their lived texture shifted with each new cohort, creating subtle differences in tone between houses that outsiders often noticed more readily than the monks themselves. In this sense, the monastic path was never a fixed destination, but an ongoing negotiation between the individual's original reasons for entering and the communal life that slowly reworked those reasons into something shared and, at times, unrecognizable even to the person who had first crossed the threshold. Once the threshold of commitment had been crossed, the monastery revealed itself not as a static refuge but as a living cadence, a sequence of hours whose repetition gradually attuned the body and mind to a different measure of time. The canonical hours formed the invisible spine of each day, drawn from ancient traditions that traced their roots to the desert fathers, yet adapted over centuries to the temperate climates and agricultural rhythms of medieval Europe. These divisions, vigils or matins in the deep night, followed by lauds at first light, prime in the early morning, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers as evening approached, and compline before rest, were never rigid clocks in the modern sense, but fluid responses to the sun's passage and the liturgical calendar, lengthening or contracting with the seasons so that winter nights might stretch the intervals between bells, while summer days compressed them into a gentler arc. The first stirring came well before any hint of dawn, often when the sky still held the dense blackness of true night, and the air inside the dormitory carried the mingled scents of woolen, blankets, damp stone, and the faint smoke of a single guttering lamp. Monks rose in near silence, the only sounds the soft rustle of habits being donned and the careful tread of bare or sandalled feet on cold floors. Vigils, sometimes called the night office, summoned the community to the church for an extended vigil of psalms and readings, whose length could vary from 2 or 3 hours in ordinary seasons to far longer on feast days, its purpose less a matter of sleep deprivation than an invitation to inhabit the quiet hours when the world outside lay most still. In some houses the readings drew from Scripture or the lives of saints, their words echoing against vaulted ceilings in tones that hovered between chant and murmur, while in others the emphasis fell on meditative repetition that allowed individual minds to wander inward even as the collective voice continued. Theories persist about whether this nocturnal rhythm fostered a particular kind of heightened awareness, or simply accommodated the practical need to align prayer with agricultural tasks that began at first light, yet the effect on newcomers was often one of gradual recalibration, the body learning to find rest in shorter intervals, and the spirit discovering that wakefulness at such an hour could feel less like interruption than participation in a hidden continuity. As the first pale light crept through narrow windows, lauds marked the transition into daylight, its shorter office of praise giving way to prime and the commencement of the day's labour. Manual work occupied the central stretches of morning and afternoon, though its character shifted according to the house's resources and the season's demands. In rural monasteries this might mean time in the fields sowing, reaping or tending livestock, tasks that required physical exertion yet unfolded within earshot of the next bell, so that prayer never entirely receded from awareness. In wealthier or more urban foundations, the same hours could be spent in the scriptorium copying texts, repairing buildings, or managing the intricate ledgers that tracked donations and tithes, each activity carrying its own cadence of repetition that echoed the liturgical pattern. Between these periods came the shorter hours of terce, sext, and none, brief returns to the church for psalms that served as punctuation marks, resetting attention and offering a few moments of stillness amid the day's outward motion. Reading, or lectio divina, filled the remaining intervals, not as casual study but as a slow, ruminative engagement with sacred texts, whose phrases were meant to be turned over in the mind during work or rest alike. The balance among these 3 elements, prayer, labour and reading, remained the ideal articulated in the rule, yet its realization varied with weather, illness, or the occasional arrival of guests, whose presence might draw monks into conversation or hospitality duties. Some foundations emphasized agricultural self-sufficiency so heavily that the fields claimed the greater share of daylight, while others, especially those near pilgrimage routes or with renowned libraries, tilted towards scholarly or artistic pursuits that left less time for heavy toil. What stayed consistent was the underlying conviction that no single strand could stand alone. Work without prayer risked becoming mere drudgery. Prayer without work could drift into abstraction, and reading without both might remain intellectual rather than transformative. Novices and long-professed monks alike moved through these alternations, the bells serving less as commands than as gentle reminders that the day itself was a kind of ongoing conversation between the visible tasks at hand and the unseen intentions that framed them. As daylight faded, Vespers gathered the community once more for an office that acknowledged the day's completion, its psalms often carrying themes of thanksgiving and protection for the night ahead. Then, after the evening meal taken in continued silence or with only a single voice reading aloud, Compline closed the sequence, its brief prayers and final blessings signalling the onset of the great silence. From that point until the next vigils, speech was set aside entirely, not as a punishment, but as a deliberate clearing of the air so that the mind might settle without the friction of unnecessary words. In the dormitory, the only sounds were the settling of bodies onto straw mattresses, the occasional creak of wooden beds, and perhaps the distant call of an owl or the soft patter of rain on the roof, elements that underscored the enclosure's separation from the restless world beyond the walls. This period of enforced quiet extended even to gestures and movements, encouraging a slower pace of thought that many later accounts described as restorative, though whether it produced mystical insight or simply the ordinary relief of mental fatigue remains a matter of individual temperament rather than uniform outcome. Throughout these hours, the monastery's architecture itself reinforced the rhythm, its cloister walks allowing measured pacing during reading periods, its refectory tables arranged for communal presence without distraction, and its church oriented so that light from the rising or setting sun would fall across the choir in ways that subtly mark the passage of each office. Yet the day was never experienced identically by every member. An older monk might find the night office more taxing on the body, while a younger one discovered unexpected clarity in the same darkness, and seasonal changes, long summer twilights versus the short, sharp winters, altered the felt duration of each interval. Guests or travellers occasionally glimpsed fragments of this pattern from the guest house, returning to the outside world with stories of bells heard across fields, or the sight of robed figures moving in ordered procession, impressions that sometimes sparked curiosity about whether such a life offered genuine peace or merely a different form of discipline. Over time, the repetition of this cycle wove itself into the fabric of memory, so that even those who had entered under external pressure began to anticipate the bells not as interruptions but as anchors, the sequence of vigils through Compline providing a structure that made the unstructured vastness of a lifetime feel navigable. The great silence at night, in particular, offered a space where the accumulated impressions of the day could settle without further commentary, allowing whatever mixture of longing, resignation, or quiet satisfaction each person carried to exist without being immediately named or judged. In this way, the canonical hours did more than organize activity. They created a shared temporal landscape in which individual rhythms could find alignment without losing their particular textures, a landscape whose boundaries remained porous enough to admit the unexpected yet firm enough to return the community again and again to the same measured sequence when dawn next approached. Yet before the first hint of dawn could approach, the monastery's deepest rhythm unfolded in the hours when the world outside lay wrapped in unbroken sleep, its fields and villages and roads emptied of travellers, its animals stilled in barns, its hearths banked to embers. The night office, known variously as vigils or matins, drew the community back into the church not as an interruption of rest, but as a deliberate continuation of the day's conversation into the darkness itself, a time when the bells that had signalled Compline now summoned the monks once more, while the sky remained black and the air outside carried the chill of dew or frost. In the dormitory the great silence had held unbroken since evening, so the awakening occurred without speech. Only the muffled creak of wooden frames as bodies rose, the whisper of woolen habits pulled over chilled limbs, and the careful gathering of belts and hoods in near total obscurity, broken only by the distant flicker of a single lamp tended by the sacristan. The experience of midnight prayer, or rather the prayer that fell between the second and third watches of the night depending on the season and the liturgical calendar, began with this collective stirring, a movement that felt at once intimate and communal, because each monk navigated the same darkness, yet carried his own private weight of drowsiness or wakeful clarity. Some houses rang a small handbell or struck a wooden board to rouse the sleepers. Others relied on the prior or a designated watcher to move quietly between beds, touching shoulders with a gentle hand. The cold stone floors under bare feet sharpened the senses even before the procession formed, and the mingled scents of sleep-warmed wool, beeswax from the lamp, and the faint must of the dormitory itself accompanied the monks as they descended stairs or crossed thresholds into the cloister walk. Here the navigation of dark cloisters became a matter of practised memory and cautious touch, fingers trailing along the cool stone of the arcade to maintain direction, while eyes adjusted to starlight, or the thin crescent of moon if the night permitted, the risk of stumbling over uneven paving or a forgotten tool left from daytime labour always present yet rarely realised after years of repetition. What unfolded in the church while the world slept was an extended sequence of psalms, antiphons, and readings whose cumulative length could stretch across 2 or 3 hours or more, performed in an interior lit only by the few candles or lamps permitted on ordinary nights, and by the occasional gleam of moonlight through high windows when the sky cleared. The choir stalls, arranged in facing rows, held the monks in ordered ranks whose voices rose and fell in the measured chant of the night office, the acoustics of the vaulted space allowing the sound to linger against stone and timber, so that one verse seemed to overlap the next in a continuous thread rather than discrete utterances. Responsories followed the readings, their melodies sometimes drawn out in the darkness to fill the resonant emptiness, while the pauses between sections permitted the mind to settle into the stillness that the outside world, free of such structure, never demanded. Theories have long circulated about the effects of this nocturnal worship on those who practiced it, some suggesting that the combination of sleep interruption and sustained vocalization fostered a state of quiet alertness akin to the heightened awareness reported by solitary hermits, while others propose it simply reflected the practical inheritance of desert traditions adapted to European latitudes, where winter nights offered abundant time before agricultural labour resumed at first light. The spiritual meaning of nocturnal worship lay less in any uniform mystical outcome than in the symbolic act of keeping vigil when most of creation rested, an echo of scriptural calls to watch and pray that medieval commentators linked to Christ's own nights of prayer in Gethsemane, or the psalmist's declarations of meditating on the law at midnight. In the shadowed church, the community enacted a form of watchfulness on behalf of the wider world, offering praise at an hour when temptation or spiritual vulnerability might be imagined as strongest, the darkness itself becoming a participant in the liturgy rather than an obstacle to it. Monks sometimes describe the sensation of the night office as one of stepping outside ordinary time, the absence of daylight stripping away visual distractions and leaving only the sound of collective voices, the texture of wooden stall underhand, and the occasional draught that stirred the flames of the few lamps. Individual temperaments coloured the experience profoundly. A younger monk might feel the cold and fatigue as acute trials that sharpen concentration, while an older brother could find the same hours bringing unexpected lucidity, or the gentle subsidence of daily concerns into a larger stillness. As the procession moved through the cloister on its return from the church, or during brief intervals when 1 or 2 monks might be sent to fetch a forgotten book or adjust a shutter, the navigation of those same dark passages took on an almost tactile intimacy. The rough surface of the wall guiding steps past the chapter house, or the warming room whose door remained closed at this hour. Rain might drum on the roof above, its rhythm blending with the fading echoes of chant, or an owl's call from beyond the enclosure walls could drift inward as a reminder of the untamed world that the monastery's boundaries held at a measured distance. The spiritual dimension deepened in these moments because the very act of moving in silence and darkness reinforced the theme of pilgrimage through uncertainty, each step an unvoiced prayer that aligned bodily motion with the interior intention of the office just concluded. Variations across houses and regions added further texture to the night hours. In stricter foundations, the office might be performed with minimal light and maximal austerity, the readings delivered in low voices that required attentive listening, while in others a greater number of candles illuminated the choir and allowed for more elaborate ceremonial gestures. On certain feast days, the night office lengthened dramatically, incorporating additional canticles or processions that circled the cloister under the open sky when weather allowed, transforming the usual inward focus into a public witness, even though the hour remained one when villagers slept. The effect on the broader community was rarely direct, yet travellers or local people sometimes reported hearing distant chanting carried on the night air, an auditory fragment that could evoke curiosity or unease about the enclosed life whose rhythms continued regardless of external events. Over repeated cycles, the nocturnal worship wove itself into the monk's sense of identity, so that waking in darkness ceased to feel like an imposition and became instead an expected threshold crossed each night, the body learning to rouse at the appointed time with a minimum of grogginess, and the spirit discovering that the quiet hours held a particular kind of availability for contemplation. The church itself, empty of its daytime visitors and stripped of ordinary light, revealed new qualities of space and sound, the stones seeming to breathe with the resonance of voices, while shadows pooled in the side chapels, and the high altar remained a distant point of faint illumination. This setting encouraged a form of prayer that was less about petition than about presence, the simple act of remaining awake and attentive when sleep would have been easier, serving as its own offering. The return to the dormitory after the office concluded often occurred while the eastern sky still showed no trace of colour, allowing a brief interval of rest before Lords would summon the community again at first light. In that short window the great silence resumed, yet the atmosphere inside the enclosure carried a subtle charge from the night's activity, a shared residue of voices and movement that lingered, even as individual monks settled back onto their mattresses. Some found sleep returning quickly, the physical exertion of rising and chanting having settled the mind, while others lay awake a little longer, turning over phrases from the readings, or simply registering the contrast between the church's resonant darkness and the closer darkness of the dormitory. Such differences were accepted as part of the human variation within the communal rhythm, the rule itself acknowledging that not every monk would experience the hours identically, yet all were called to participate in them. In this way, the night office extended the canonical pattern into the realm where ordinary life surrendered to unconsciousness, offering the monastery's distinctive gift of structured wakefulness at the hour when the surrounding world most completely relinquished its claims. The cloisters, the church, and the dormitory together formed a landscape traversed repeatedly in darkness, each passage reinforcing the conviction that time itself could be sanctified by intention, rather than by the presence or absence of sunlight. Over years and decades, this repeated crossing of the night hours accumulated into a quiet form of knowledge, less a dramatic revelation than a gradual attunement in which the body and the spirit learned to inhabit the stillness that the bells continued to mark even when no one outside the walls remained awake to hear them. As the eastern sky at last began to show the faintest wash of grey, the same dormitory that had sheltered the night's return now revealed its own quiet architecture. A long unadorned hall whose plain stone walls and evenly spaced windows had been shaped precisely to support the rhythm of communal awakening without ever drawing attention to themselves. The layout of the entire monastery expressed this same intention. Every wall, passage and open space was arranged to turn the community inward toward prayer, and outward only in carefully measured service, creating an enclosed world whose proportions mirrored the ordered harmony the monks sought to recover from the scattered distractions of ordinary life. In most foundations, the buildings formed a quadrangle around the central cloister, with the church anchoring the eastern side so that the rising sun would strike its altar first, a daily reminder that the physical arrangement itself participated in the liturgy rather than merely containing it. Theories among later scholars have sometimes linked this preference for eastward orientation to older traditions of solar symbolism inherited from early Christian communities, though the practical advantage of aligning the daily offices with the movement of light across the interior spaces was equally compelling, and required no special doctrine to justify. The cloister itself stood at the physical and spiritual centre, a covered walkway surrounding a small open garth where a fountain or well often provided the only running water within the enclosure. Here the monks walked in measured circuits during intervals between offices, their feet tracing the same flagstones year after year, while their minds rehearsed psalms or simply rested in the repetitive motion. The arcade offered shelter from rain, yet remained open to the air, so that the changing seasons entered the daily round without ever breaching the boundary that separated the monastery from the surrounding fields and villages. In this space, the community's collective identity was most visibly enacted. No monk walked alone for long, yet conversation was limited to necessary exchanges, allowing the architecture to foster both companionship and interior silence. Some houses planted the central garth with medicinal herbs or a single symbolic tree, turning the cloister into a miniature garden of paradise, whose ordered beds echoed the larger pattern of self-sufficient cultivation beyond the walls. The very act of moving through these covered walks at dawn, when the night office's chant still lingered in memory, allowed the body to carry the darkness forward into the growing light, each column and arch serving as a tactile marker of the transition from vigil to the day's first labour. Beyond the cloister, the church rose as the largest and most symbolically charged structure, its nave and transepts forming the shape of a cross, whose arms extended toward the four directions, while its eastern end focused all movement on the high altar. The proportions were rarely left to chance. Even in modest houses, the height of the vaulting and the spacing of the piers were calculated to lift the voice in chant and to distribute sound evenly among the choir stalls ranged along the eastern bays. Windows placed high in the walls admitted shafts of light that moved across the floor according to the hour and season, an effect that some medieval commentators described as the daily reenactment of divine illumination entering the soul. At night, these same windows became sources of starlight or moonlight, their glass sometimes coloured yet often clear, so that the darkness outside remained visible and the interior retained a sense of connection to the wider cosmos. The crypt beneath the eastern end, when present, offered a lower, more intimate space for relics and private prayer, its vaulted ceiling low enough to encourage kneeling and its darkness deeper than the church above, creating a layered experience of sacred depth that mirrored the descent into contemplation itself. Practical spaces were integrated into this symbolic framework rather than set apart from it. The refectory, usually placed on the southern side of the cloister for warmth, was a long, narrow hall whose raised reading pulpit allowed one monk to recite during meals, while the others ate in silence, the architecture itself enforcing the discipline of listening, even in the most ordinary act of nourishment. Long wooden tables ran the length of the room, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of hands, and the single high window at the eastern end caught the morning light, so that the reader's book would be illuminated without the need for candles. The dormitory, often directly above the chapter house or connected by a night stair to the church, was designed for rapid assembly and dispersal. A single open chamber with beds aligned in rows, its high ceiling allowing air to circulate yet its lack of partitions reminding every sleeper that rest itself was a shared discipline rather than a private retreat. The chapter house, typically an octagonal or rectangular chamber opening from the eastern walk of the cloister, served as the daily meeting place where the community gathered after prime to hear a chapter of the rule, to confess faults, and to discuss matters of governance. Its acoustics were often tuned for clear speech rather than chant, with stone benches built into the walls so that every voice could reach the centre without strain, and its door positioned so that the prior could enter last, underscoring the space's role in maintaining the delicate balance between authority and communal consent. Moving through these spaces at the close of the night office, as the monks had done only moments earlier, made the symbolic and practical dimensions inseparable. The same cloister arcade that guided their steps in darkness would later frame the daylight processions of feast days. The church, whose resonant darkness had amplified the night psalms, would soon fill with the warmer light of Lauds. Even the chapter house, empty at this hour, awaited its role in the cycle of correction and renewal that kept the community aligned with its founding intentions. Variations among orders added further nuance. Cistercian houses favoured extreme simplicity, their churches stripped of decoration so that the stone itself became the primary symbol, while Benedictine foundations sometimes allowed carved capitals or painted walls whose images could serve as silent text for those who could not read. In every case, the architecture was understood not as a fixed container, but as an instrument that shaped the senses and the spirit over years of repeated use, its proportions and orientations guiding the body toward postures of prayer and the mind toward an awareness of sacred order. As the light strengthened outside the dormitory windows, these same walls that had held the night's stillness now prepared to receive the day's first visitors from the world beyond. Their enduring presence a reminder that the monastery's secret life was sustained as much by the stones as by the voices that moved among them. As the light strengthened outside the dormitory windows, these same walls that had held the night's stillness now prepared to receive the day's first visitors from the world beyond. Their enduring presence a reminder that the monastery's secret life was sustained as much by the stones as by the voices that moved among them. In many foundations, a low passage led directly from the eastern walk of the cloister into the Scriptorium, a chamber set apart yet never entirely isolated, its single door positioned so that the prior could pass through without disturbing the larger rhythm of offices and labour. Here the air carried a different texture, cooler and drier, preserved by thick walls and small high windows that admitted a steady northern light without the glare of direct sun. The floor, often paved with smooth flagstones or even beaten earth in simpler houses, absorbed the sound of footsteps so that the only audible movements were the faint scratch of quills and the occasional soft turning of a finished leaf. Within this space the work of the scribes unfolded as a continuation of the night office rather than a separate occupation, each monk seated at a slanted desk whose angle had been calculated to keep the wrist steady through hours of copying. The desks themselves were narrow and unadorned, sometimes no more than a board fixed between two uprights, yet their arrangement in long rows allowed a dozen or more brothers to work without their shadows falling across one another's pages. Inkhorns rested in small hollows cut into the wood, while racks nearby held the carefully prepared quills, each one trimmed from goose or swan feather according to the fineness of the script required. Sheets of parchment, scraped and stretched from sheepskin or calf, lay stacked at one end of the desk, their surfaces still faintly warm from the drying process that had taken place weeks earlier in the yard beyond the cloister. The making of a single book extended across months and sometimes years, beginning not with the act of writing but with the selection and preparation of materials whose quality would determine whether the text survived the centuries. A scribe might spend days examining a fresh hide for thin spots or scars left by the animal's life, then soaking, liming, and scraping it until the surface became translucent enough to accept ink without bleeding through. Theories among modern scholars suggest that some houses maintained small flocks of animals raised specifically for parchment, their diet and age chosen to produce the finest vellum, though the records remain sparse and the practice may have varied widely according to the wealth of each foundation. Once prepared, the sheets were folded and pricked with a sharp awl to mark the lines that would guide the writing, a grid so precise that the ruling often remained visible even after the text had been added. Copying itself demanded a concentration that bordered on the contemplative, the scribe's eye moving from exemplar to page in measured rhythms, while the hand reproduced each letter without flourish or haste. Errors were not simply corrected, but sometimes left as silent testimonies to human fallibility, or else erased with a knife so delicately that the surface retained almost no trace of the change. In larger scriptoria, a division of labour emerged naturally. One brother might rule the pages and prepare the ink from oak galls and iron salts. Another would copy the main text in a clear book hand, while a third, perhaps more skilled in drawing, added the initial capitals or marginal decorations. The ink itself varied in tone from deep black to a softer brown depending on the season and the age of the gall, its consistency tested each morning against a scrap of spare parchment so that the flow would remain even through the longest column. Illumination transformed these pages into objects of devotion rather than mere repositories of words. The gold leaf and mineral pigments applied only after the text had dried completely so that no smudge would mar the sacred content. The process began with a light underdrawing in lead or charcoal, its faint lines later strengthened with ink and then filled with colour ground from lapis lazuli for the richest blues, verdigris for greens, or cinnabar for the vivid reds that framed the opening words of a gospel or psalm. Theories persist that some illuminators worked from memory or from pattern books passed quietly among houses, adapting older motifs of vines, birds, and geometric interlace to new theological emphases, though the precise transmission of these designs remains a matter of scholarly reconstruction rather than documented certainty. The application of gold required its own quiet ritual. The leaf was laid over a prepared ground of gesso and burnished with a smooth stone or tooth, until it caught the light like a miniature window into heaven itself. Far from mere ornament, these images were understood by many medieval writers as visual prayers, their intricate borders and historiated initials guiding the reader's eye toward the mysteries contained in the words and through them toward the divine order that ordered all creation. The libraries that grew from these labours formed the hidden heart of the monastery's intellectual life. Their chained volumes protected not only from theft, but from the casual handling that might wear the delicate pages. In some houses the collection occupied a small room adjoining the scriptorium, its shelves built against the walls so that the books stood upright with their spines turned inward, titles written along the four edges for easy identification. Catalogues, when they existed, were often kept as separate lists rather than bound inventories, allowing the librarian to note new acquisitions or loans without disturbing the volumes themselves. Ancient texts survived here because the daily round of copying and correction kept them in active use rather than sealed away. A single copy of Augustine or Boethius might pass through several generations of scribes, each adding marginal notes that recorded the community's ongoing conversation with the past. Possibilities remain that certain monasteries exchanged exemplars with distant houses along pilgrimage routes or through visiting scholars, thereby preserving works that might otherwise have vanished during periods of unrest, though the extent of such networks is difficult to measure from the surviving evidence alone. The act of reading in the library carried its own discipline. A monk might request a volume at the beginning of the day, carry it to a nearby carrel or return to his desk in the scriptorium, and return it at the close of daylight so that the collection stayed intact for communal use. In this way the library became an extension of the cloister's ordered movement, its quiet shelves mirroring the measured circuits of the covered walk, and its carefully copied texts offering another form of the same interior silence cultivated in the night offices. As the morning light shifted across the high windows, the scribes continued their measured work, their quills tracing lines that would outlast the stones around them and carry the accumulated wisdom of earlier centuries into futures they could not imagine. The scriptorium thus stood not as a separate workshop, but as another chamber in which the monastery's secret life found expression, its painstaking labour joining the physical preparation of parchment with the spiritual intention that every copied word might serve as a ladder for the soul. In this enclosed space, the boundary between preservation and creation blurred, each new manuscript both a faithful reproduction and a fresh act of devotion, whose gold and colour invited later readers into the same contemplative stillness that had shaped its making. Beyond the scriptorium's narrow door, the cloister walk opened onto a different rhythm of labour, one that carried the same measured intention outward into the open air, where the morning sun now touched the garden plots laid out in neat rectangles behind the eastern range. Here the soil had been turned and enriched over generations, its dark surface broken by low stone borders that kept each bed distinct, planted with rows of lavender and sage whose silver-green leaves released a sharp fragrance when brushed by passing sleeves. Monks moved among them in pairs or small groups, some kneeling to lift clumps of soil around the roots of rosemary and hyssop, others carrying woven baskets already heavy with cuttings of mint and fennel, destined for the infirmary shelves. These physic gardens formed a living extension of the manuscript work just left behind, for the same hands that had ruled parchment lines now traced the careful patterns of raised beds, whose herbs would be dried, pounded, and mixed into remedies recorded in the very volumes copied within those walls. The layout itself followed patterns refined through centuries of observation, with taller plants such as lecampain and angelica placed to the north so they would not shade the lower thymes and violets, while narrow paths of beaten earth allowed easy passage even after rain without compacting the earth around delicate roots. Theories among historians suggest that certain houses maintained separate sections for culinary herbs near the kitchen, and a more secluded medicinal quarter screened by hedges, though surviving plans indicate considerable variation according to the size and resources of each foundation. A brother trained in the properties of plants might pause at a particular bed to note how the season's growth compared with entries in the house's herbal, adding small observations that would later guide the preparation of syrups or salves. In this way the garden became another form of quiet study, its cycles of planting, tending and harvesting mirroring the repetitive strokes of the quill and offering the same opportunity for sustained attention without haste. Beyond the garden walls stretched the larger fields and pastures that supplied the community's grain, wool and timber, lands often reclaimed from marsh or woodland through patient effort that combined manual labour with simple hydraulic knowledge. Cistercian houses in particular became known for their systematic drainage of low-lying ground, cutting channels that directed seasonal floods into fish ponds, while turning former waste into arable strips whose yield supported both the monks and the lay brothers who worked alongside them. Crop rotation practiced on these holdings followed a three-field system in many regions, with one portion left fallow to restore fertility, another sown to wheat or barley, and the third given to legumes whose nitrogen-fixing roots improved the soil for the following season. Such methods were not invented within the cloister, yet found consistent application there because the community remained in place across generations, able to observe results over decades rather than single lifetimes. Possibilities remain that exchanges of seed stock between distant monasteries helped introduce hardier varieties suited to local climates, though records of such transfers survive only in scattered charters and estate accounts. The same fields supplied the raw materials for brewing and cheesemaking, activities carried out in dedicated outbuildings, where the day's milk and grain were transformed into storable goods. In the brew house, a low fire warmed copper vessels filled with malted barley steeped in water drawn from the monastery's own spring. The resulting wort boiled with hops or herbs, before fermentation, in large wooden casks whose staves had been shaped from local oak. Ale and beer formed a daily staple, safer than untreated water and nourishing enough to sustain the long hours of office and labour, with stronger batches reserved for feast days or the occasional visitor. Cheese production followed its own seasonal rhythm, the curds pressed in wooden moulds and stored on racks in cool cellars, where they aged under the watchful care of a designated brother who turned each wheel at regular intervals. Preservation techniques extended to salting fish caught in the abbey ponds, drying fruits on racks in the sun, and packing root vegetables in layers of sand within stone-lined pits that kept them firm through winter. These crafts required patience and accumulated knowledge passed from one generation of monks to the next, their methods refined through trial rather than written instruction alone. Self-sufficiency emerged naturally from this integrated pattern of cultivation and craft, allowing many houses to meet their own needs for food, drink and clothing, while producing modest surpluses that could be exchanged for salt, iron, or parchment supplies not available on the estate. The economics rested less on profit than on stability. The rule's emphasis on manual labour, ensuring that each able member contributed to the common store without reliance on external charity, beyond the occasional pious gift. In wealthier foundations, the surplus might include fine wool from carefully managed flocks, or honey from hives placed at the orchard edge, items that found ready buyers at nearby markets, or through travelling merchants who valued the consistent quality maintained under monastic oversight. Yet the core intention remained inward, the gardens and fields serving first to free the community from distraction, so that prayer and study could continue uninterrupted. As the sun climbed higher, the brothers returned from the outer fields carrying tools and produce, their baskets adding to the store already gathered in the garden, the day's labour folding back into the cloister's quieter circuits. The same careful attention that shaped the scriptorium now extended across these productive spaces, each plant and animal forming part of an ordered whole, whose rhythm sustained the hidden life within the walls. In this outward extension of the monastery's economy, the boundary between necessity and devotion grew thin, the harvest of herbs and grain becoming another form of the same sustained intention that copied texts and sang the night offices, their fruits offered in turn to support the silence that made all other work possible. From the garden beds where lavender and sage still clung to the brothers' sleeves, the path turned inward once more, leading past the southern cloister range toward a low stone building set slightly apart, its windows shuttered against draughts yet always ready to open at the sound of approaching steps. Within these walls the same herbs gathered under the morning sun found their next purpose, for the care of the sick had long been counted among the works of mercy that bound the monastic life to its founding promises. The rule itself placed the treatment of the infirm at the heart of communal duty, reminding each brother that the suffering guest or ailing monk was to be received as Christ himself, an obligation that turned ordinary acts of nursing into extensions of prayer rather than interruptions of it. In the infirmary the day began with the same measured quiet that governed the choir, though the voices here were softer and the hours shaped around the needs of those confined to narrow beds. A designated brother, often one who had studied the house's collection of medical texts alongside the liturgical books, moved from pallet to pallet noting pulses and temperatures with the same attentive stillness once applied to ruling parchment. Herbal infusions steeped overnight in earthenware vessels released the scents of hyssop and fennel, their preparation guided by recipes copied and annotated across generations, each entry carrying small marginal notes on which plants had proved most reliable in particular seasons. Early medical knowledge within the cloister drew from both classical authorities, preserved in the library and accumulated observation, blending Galenic ideas of balance with practical trials of local remedies. Historians note that such houses frequently exchanged letters describing successful treatments, creating informal networks of information that crossed regions without formal universities yet in place. Bloodletting, when judged necessary, followed lunar calendars recorded in the same computers tables used for calculating Easter, the procedure performed with careful ritual to avoid excess, while restoring the equilibrium thought to govern health. Patients received lighter portions at mealtimes, often broths enriched with the very herbs grown in the physic's garden, and were granted exemption from the full round of offices so that rest itself became part of the healing discipline. Theories among scholars suggest that some infirmaries maintained separate wards for contagious cases, or for the elderly whose frailty required longer stays, though surviving accounts show considerable variation according to the size and resources of each foundation. Throughout these routines, the emphasis remained on restoration rather than cure alone, the brothers understanding that bodily comfort served the larger aim of returning the individual to participation in the community's spiritual rhythm whenever strength allowed. Travellers arriving at the gate after nightfall received the same attention once their immediate needs for shelter and food were met, for the monastery's role as hospital extended naturally to those worn by the road. A separate guest hall often adjoined the infirmary, its beds kept ready with fresh straw and woolen blankets, while a brother trained in simple, prepared warming drinks from dried roots and berries to ease chilled limbs. The poor who sought alms at the almonry door might also find treatment for wounds or fevers, their care recorded in the same ledgers that tracked distributions of bread, an acknowledgement that the monastery's stability imposed a responsibility toward the wider world it otherwise sought to hold at a distance. For the dying, the infirmary became the final threshold, its routines shifting from attempts at recovery to the quiet accompaniment of last hours. A priest remained nearby to administer the sacraments, while other brothers kept vigil in turns, their presence offering both physical comfort and the assurance that no soul passed alone. Simple ointments eased laboured breathing, and the windows were opened at the moment of death so that the departing spirit might follow the rising incense toward whatever lay beyond. Possibilities remain that certain houses developed particular reputations for skilled care in these final stages, drawing pilgrims or local families who wished their relatives to end their days within consecrated walls, though such patterns depended on local custom and the individual community's resources. In this way, the infirmary completed the circle begun in the Scriptorium and continued through the gardens, transforming the knowledge preserved in manuscripts and the plants tended with patient hands into direct service. The same sustained attention that copied texts and ordered beds now watched over the vulnerable, its quiet repetitions offering a different yet equally necessary form of the ordered life that sustained the hidden world behind the walls. As evening offices drew near, those strong enough might join the distant chant from their beds, the voices within and without blending once more into the single rhythm that defined the monastic day. From the measured stillness of the infirmary, where the same careful hands that mixed simples also turned the pages of medical treatises, the quiet path of monastic life led onward to the places where knowledge itself was gathered, copied, and passed forward. The low stone building that housed the library stood not far from the cloister walk, its shelves and chests holding volumes whose very survival, through centuries of upheaval, still invites wonder, each one a thread connecting the brothers to voices from centuries before. Here the daily rhythm of prayer and labour found its counterpart in study, for the rule of Benedict had long required that every monk devote certain hours to reading, turning the mind towards sacred texts and the commentaries that explained them. Monastic schools arose naturally within these enclosures, beginning as gatherings of novices and oblates who learned their letters under the guidance of an older brother appointed as teacher. In the earliest centuries, when formal institutions beyond the cloister were few, these schools became the primary centres where boys destined for the religious life mastered Latin grammar, arithmetic for calculating the calendar, and the rudiments of music needed to chant the offices correctly. Cathedral schools, established in the larger towns around a bishop's seat, followed a similar pattern, yet often reached beyond the monastery walls, welcoming clerks and sometimes lay students who sought preparation for service in the church or the growing royal administrations. The two traditions overlapped more than they diverged, sharing masters and manuscripts, so that a promising student might move from one to the other as opportunity allowed. Historians observe that such arrangements created informal networks of learning long before universities existed, with letters and travelling scholars carrying questions and answers between houses scattered across regions. The preservation of classical texts formed one of the most enduring contributions of these centres, though the process unfolded quietly and without fanfare. During the centuries sometimes called the Dark Ages, when invasions and the collapse of earlier political structures scattered libraries and silenced many schools, monastic scriptoria continued to copy works by Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca alongside the writings of the Church Fathers. The labour was painstaking, Each volume required months or years of careful transcription onto parchment, with corrections noted in margins and occasional illustrations added to aid memory. Without these repeated acts of copying, many ancient authors would have vanished entirely, their words surviving only in fragments or not at all. Theories among scholars suggest that the choice of which text to preserve often reflected the practical needs of the community. Medical treatises for the infirmary, legal compilations for resolving disputes, astronomical tables for fixing the date of Easter. Yet the presence of poetry and philosophy indicates a broader curiosity that reached beyond immediate utility. The same brothers who illuminated gospel books might also reproduce Ovid or Pliny, their hands moving steadily under the light of a single window while the rest of the house observed silence. Among those who carried this scholarly work forward, certain figures stand out for the range and depth of their contributions. Bede, working in the monastery at Jarrow in the early 8th century, composed histories, commentaries, and scientific treatises that drew on both classical and Christian sources, his careful citation of earlier writers demonstrating an awareness of intellectual inheritance. Alcuin, trained in York and later summoned to the court of Charlemagne, helped shape a revival of learning that spread across Frankish territories, establishing schools and standardizing texts so that distant houses might share a common curriculum. Later centuries produced thinkers such as Anselm of Canterbury, whose writings explored the boundaries between faith and reason, and the compilers of encyclopedic works that gathered knowledge from many disciplines into single volumes for reference. These monastics did not work in isolation. Their letters and visits created conversations that crossed linguistic and political boundaries, allowing ideas to circulate even when travel remained slow and uncertain. Possibilities remain that some houses maintained reputations for particular strengths, one known for astronomy, another for medicine or dialectic, drawing students and manuscripts from afar and thereby enriching the larger web of learning. The roots of European universities can be traced, at least in part, to these same monastic and cathedral schools, though the transition was gradual and uneven. By the 12th century, the growing demand for trained administrators and theologians led certain cathedral centres, such as those in Paris and Bologna, to organise more formally, granting degrees and attracting masters who lectured publicly. Monastic orders contributed directly to this development. The Cistercians and later the Mendicant friars established houses of study in university towns, so that their members might pursue advanced learning while remaining under the discipline of their order. The curriculum that took shape, beginning with the trivium of grammar, rhetoric and logic, then advancing to the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, echoed the subjects long taught within monastery walls. Over time, the universities gained charters and a measure of independence, yet they retained close ties to the religious houses that supplied both students and the foundational texts their libraries required. Scholars note that without the centuries of copying and teaching accomplished in relative seclusion, the sudden flowering of higher learning in the later Middle Ages would have lacked the necessary soil. Within the monastery itself, the daily encounter with books continued to shape the interior life of the community. After the morning offices, those not assigned to manual labour might retire to the cloister, or a designated reading area, where a single volume passed from hand to hand or rested on a lectern for shared study. Novices learned to pass difficult passages under the patient correction of their elders, while more experienced monks prepared sermons or composed new commentaries that might themselves be copied and sent to sister houses. The library catalogue, often recorded in a simple list or inscribed on the wall, served as a map of the community's intellectual holdings, revealing which works were considered essential and which remained rare treasures consulted only on special occasions. Theories suggest that the very act of reading in common fostered a shared vocabulary and set of references that strengthened the bonds of brotherhood, turning individual study into an extension of the communal prayer that framed each day. As the light faded and the bell summoned the brothers back to the choir, the knowledge preserved and transmitted in these centres found its place once more within the larger rhythm. The texts that had guided medical care in the infirmary, ordered the gardens, and shaped the liturgy now rested in their chests, awaiting the next morning's quiet attention. In this way, the monastic schools and libraries completed another circle, linking the practical demands of daily life to the long conversation across centuries that defined the hidden world behind the walls. From the measured stillness of the libraries and schools, where minds turned over ancient words and the slow labour of copying bound one generation to the next, the monastic day drew the brothers and sisters toward another circle of communal life, one that sustained the body even as the hours of prayer sustained the spirit. In the kitchens tucked behind the cloister, or set near the outer court for practical reasons of smoke and waste, the preparation of meals unfolded with the same deliberate rhythm that governed every other task. What reached the tables was rarely elaborate, yet it carried its own quiet complexity shaped by season, region, and the enduring tension between austerity and the necessities of health. Bread formed the steady foundation, baked from the monastery's own grain in large round loaves that might last several days, their crusts thick and their interiors dense with the flavour of whatever local wheat or rye the fields had yielded. Vegetables from the gardens, roots stored through winter, and fish from nearby rivers or ponds supplied the greater part of what was eaten, while meat remained largely absent except in cases of illness or the rare permission granted by a visiting superior. The rule of Benedict had set the tone centuries earlier by allowing 2 cooked dishes each day along with a pound of bread and a measure of wine or ale, yet the actual practice varied with the house and the era, inviting historians to trace how local customs softened or intensified those guidelines. In northern climates, where winters lingered and fresh produce grew scarce, the diet leaned more heavily on preserved foods and the hearty brews that monks themselves produced in dedicated outbuildings, their recipes refined over generations to yield a nourishing drink that supplied calories and vitamins when other sources ran thin. Beer, often weaker than modern varieties and sometimes flavoured with herbs or spices from the medicinal plots, appeared at nearly every meal in many English and German houses, its presence so ordinary that it passed without comment in the account books, yet sustained labourers through long days of field work or manuscript copying. Nuns in convents followed parallel patterns, though their kitchens sometimes emphasised dairy products or eggs, when the community maintained its own flocks, creating small but telling differences that reflected the distinct economic networks of female houses. Fasting rules added another layer of discipline that shaped not only what was eaten but when and how. On ordinary days the main meal came after none, the mid-afternoon office, with a lighter collation permitted in the evening. During Lent and on other penitential seasons this narrowed further to one full meal, the absence of food intended to turn attention inward. Yet feast days brought exceptions that broke the pattern and reminded the community of joy as well as restraint, allowing meat on certain solemnities, extra portions, or even the rare indulgence of spiced dishes prepared from stored fruits and nuts. These variations were not uniform across orders or centuries, and scholars continue to debate how strictly individual houses enforced them, noting that the records sometimes show allowances for the young, the elderly, or those recovering in the infirmary. The possibility remains that some communities interpreted the rules more flexibly during periods of scarcity, balancing spiritual ideals against the practical demands of survival in remote locations. The refectory itself stood as a space where silence transformed the act of eating into an extension of prayer rather than a mere interruption. Long wooden tables lined the hall, benches arranged so that all faced inward, and a raised pulpit or lectern allowed one brother to read aloud from Scripture or the lives of saints while the others ate without speaking. This custom, drawn directly from the rule, turned the meal into a shared meditation, the sound of the reader's voice filling the room above the quiet clatter of wooden bowls and spoons. In some houses the reading rotated among the more learned members, ensuring that even those assigned to kitchen duty heard the same passages, while in others a fixed text might continue across several days to allow deeper reflection. The silence was not absolute, of course. Signals with the fingers or quiet gestures passed necessary requests to the servers, and the prior or abbess might offer a brief word of instruction when required. Yet the overall effect remained one of ordered calm, a deliberate contrast to the noisy taverns and feast halls of the world beyond the walls. Surprising variety emerged within these constraints, especially when one considers the regional differences and the occasional windfalls that reached even the most austere tables. Along the coasts, salted herring or other preserved fish supplemented the diet for weeks at a time, while inland houses relied more on beans, cabbage, and the eggs that hens supplied in season. The Cistercians, known for their emphasis on simplicity, sometimes adopted even stricter limits than Benedictine houses, yet their self-sufficient farms could produce cheeses or honey that added subtle richness on permitted days. Theories among historians suggest that the brewing of beer and the baking of bread served not only nutritional needs but also economic ones, as surplus ale or extra loaves might be traded with neighbouring villages, generating modest income that supported the purchase of salt, oil, or spices otherwise unavailable. In this way, the kitchens connected the monastery to the wider landscape, drawing in resources from the gardens, farms, and fisheries described in earlier chapters of monastic life while sending out small but tangible goods in return. The daily passage from the scriptorium or the fields into the refectory thus marked a shift from intellectual or physical labour to the shared necessity of nourishment. The same brothers who had pondered texts or tended manuscripts now seated in ordered rows, listening as the reader's voice wove sacred words around the simple act of eating. In convents, the pattern repeated with gentle adaptations, the sisters gathering under similar rules yet sometimes incorporating the work of their own hands in the preparation of herbal infusions or fruit preserves that brightened the table on feast days. Over time, these customs evolved, influenced by reforming abbots or changing agricultural conditions, so that a 12th century meal might differ noticeably from its 10th century counterpart, without ever abandoning the core commitment to moderation. The kitchens themselves, often equipped with large hearths, stone sinks fed by channeled water, and storage cellars that kept root vegetables cool through summer, stood as quiet witnesses to this balance, their fires tended by assigned brothers whose labour ensured that the community could maintain its rhythm of prayer and study without the distraction of hunger. Possibilities linger in the surviving account rolls and visitation records that some houses experimented with greater diversity than the rules strictly required, perhaps testing new crops introduced through contacts with returning pilgrims, or experimenting with fermentation techniques that improved the keeping qualities of ale. Such innovations remained grounded in the same spirit of self-sufficiency that had guided the planting of gardens and the management of farms, linking the preparation of food directly to the broader economy of the enclosure. As the light of late afternoon slanted through the refectory windows and the final reading drew to a close, the community rose together, the silence giving way once more to the measured footsteps that carried everyone back toward the choir or the evening offices, the body restored and the mind already turning toward the next hour of the day. In this measured alternation between labour, learning, and the simple sustenance of bread and beer, the hidden life behind the walls revealed another of its enduring patterns, one that sustained generations without fanfare, yet left traces still visible in the ruins of kitchens and the yellowed pages of old ledgers. From the measured stillness of the refectory and the quiet economies of kitchens that turned grain, roots, and ale into daily sustenance, the same patterns of careful management often extended outward, allowing monastic communities to gather resources that reached far beyond immediate needs. What began as grants of marginal land or small endowments for the upkeep of altars could, over generations, grow into extensive holdings, the possibility lingering in charters and charters that donors sought spiritual returns for their generosity. Nobles facing uncertain heirs or the prospect of judgment after death frequently transferred estates, mills, or villages to a favoured house, securing in return the promise of masses and prayers that would continue long after their own lifetimes. These bequests were rarely simple acts of charity alone. Historians note how they sometimes served to place property under the protection of the church, shielding it from rival claimants or royal taxation in an age when secular authority remained fluid and contested. In this way, the fields described earlier, already producing bread and beer for the community, could multiply into networks of dependent farms whose surpluses flowed back through rents paid in kind or coin, creating modest accumulations that supported building campaigns or the purchase of rare manuscripts. The process unfolded unevenly across regions and centuries, inviting scholars to trace how early medieval houses in Francia or Anglo-Saxon England received initial gifts from local lords eager to found or endow a monastery on their estates, while later expansions drew on royal favour as kings sought reliable allies in contested territories. A single donation of woodland might yield timber for construction and pasture for livestock, yet the same holding could attract further grants when neighbouring families observed the prestige attached to association with a thriving community. Theories among historians suggest that some monasteries deliberately cultivated these relationships by offering hospitality to travelling nobles, or by maintaining guest houses that doubled as centres of influence, their tables set with the same simple fare yet surrounded by an aura of sanctity that made patronage feel like an act of devotion rather than mere politics. Over time, these lands accumulated in scattered parcels, sometimes requiring careful negotiation to consolidate holdings or to resolve disputes with secular neighbours, and the records preserved in cartularies reveal both the steady growth and the occasional reversals when a grant was contested or reclaimed. Relationships with kings and nobles thus formed an intricate web that bound the enclosure to the wider realm, without ever fully erasing the boundary between sacred and secular life. Monarchs from the Carolingian era onward issued diplomas confirming monastic privileges, exempting lands from certain dues, or granting rights to hold markets and fairs, steps that enhanced economic independence while tying the community more closely to royal interests. In return, houses might supply scribes for royal chanceries, provide lodging during progresses through the countryside, or lend their moral authority to legitimize contested successions. Nobles of lesser rank followed similar patterns, their gifts often calibrated to the standing of the monastery itself, so that a great Benedictine abbey might attract bequests from counts and dukes, while a smaller Cistercian grange drew support from local knights. The possibility remains that these exchanges occasionally blurred into something closer to feudal arrangements, with monasteries owing military service or counsel in times of crisis, even as the rule continued to emphasize separation from worldly entanglements. Such ties proved especially visible in border regions, where houses could serve as neutral ground for negotiations, or as repositories for charters that recorded treaties and inheritances, their archives preserving evidence of both spiritual and temporal authority. At the centre of these networks stood the abbot, whose role extended well beyond the cloister into the realm of high politics. Chosen often from among the brothers yet frequently drawn from noble lineages, the abbot combined spiritual oversight with administrative command over extensive properties and dependent populations. In many houses the position carried the status of a great lord, complete with the right to hold courts, collect fines, and even muster armed retainers when royal summons required it. Contemporary accounts suggest that abbots travelled regularly to royal assemblies or ecclesiastical synods, their presence lending weight to decisions on taxation, warfare, or church reform, while simultaneously advancing the interests of their own communities. The abbot might negotiate directly with bishops over jurisdictional boundaries or intercede with the king on behalf of a lay patron whose family had long supported the monastery. The same measured voice that once read during meals now shaping policy in council chambers. Variations across orders reveal how Cistercian abbots, bound by stricter ideals of simplicity, sometimes resisted such entanglements more successfully than their Cluniac counterparts, whose greater wealth invited deeper involvement in affairs of state. Yet even here the records hint at flexibility, with some abbots delegating temporal duties to priors or lay stewards, so that the contemplative rhythm of the choir could remain undisturbed. This accumulation of influence did not pass without notice or reproach, and over the centuries voices both inside and outside the monastic world began to question whether wealth had begun to erode the original vows of poverty and humility. Early reformers such as the Cistercians themselves emerged partly in reaction to perceived excesses in older Benedictine houses, their emphasis on remote sites and manual labour intended to restore a purer form of separation from material concerns. Later critics, including wandering preachers and university scholars, pointed to the contrast between grand abbey churches adorned with gold and silver and the austere cells that still housed the monks, the possibility lingering that such displays served to attract further donations, while distancing the community from the ideals set forth in the rule. Visitation records from the later Middle Ages occasionally note instances of luxurious furnishings or relaxed discipline in wealthier houses, though scholars continue to debate how widespread these practices truly were, and whether they reflected genuine corruption or simply the natural evolution of institutions managing large estates across changing economic conditions. Nobles and kings sometimes joined the chorus of criticism when they sought to reclaim alienated lands, or to redirect monastic revenues toward military campaigns, their complaints framed as moral concern yet rooted in the same political calculations that had once encouraged patronage. The tension between spiritual purpose and temporal power thus remained a recurring theme, one that shaped both the internal life of the monastery and its standing in the wider society. In some regions, royal confiscations or forced reforms periodically reset the balance, while in others the abbot's political stature allowed the community to weather storms that overwhelmed secular landowners. The same lands that supplied bread and ale could also fund the construction of defensive walls or the maintenance of roads that benefited travellers and pilgrims, blurring the line between self-sufficiency and public utility. Historians exploring these dynamics often highlight how female houses navigated similar waters with fewer resources and greater restrictions, their abbesses exercising influence through networks of kinship rather than direct participation in royal councils. Through all these shifts, the core commitment to prayer and stability persisted, even as the visible signs of wealth invited both admiration and unease from those who observed the monastic world from beyond its walls. In this interplay of donation and dominion, counsel and critique, the hidden life revealed another layer of its enduring complexity, one that sustained communities across centuries while continually testing the boundaries between renunciation and responsibility. Yet the experiences of women within these enclosed worlds often unfolded along paths marked by even greater seclusion and distinct forms of devotion, their houses sometimes founded on the margins of noble estates, or within the protective shadow of larger male communities where resources flowed less freely, and autonomy rested on delicate negotiations with bishops and kin. Women who chose the religious life did so amid a range of possibilities that historians continue to weigh against the sparse records of charters and saints' lives, some entering as children offered by families seeking spiritual merit or relief from the cost of dowries, others arriving later as widows who brought lands or influence in exchange for a measure of security and prayerful intercession for their departed kin. The decision might reflect genuine piety shaped by exposure to itinerant preachers or family chapels, yet the chance remains that for certain noble daughters it also offered an alternative to arranged marriages or the uncertainties of inheritance disputes, allowing a life oriented towards stability rather than the political alliances that defined secular womanhood. In regions like Anglo-Saxon England or the Rhineland, early foundations sometimes arose from the patronage of royal or aristocratic women themselves, their endowments creating spaces where daughters of the elite could pursue learning or contemplation without the direct oversight that later centuries would impose through stricter enclosure rules. Daily life in medieval convents followed rhythms that echoed the divine office of male houses, yet adapted to circumstances of limited labour and greater dependence on external priests for the sacraments, with nuns rising for matins in the chill before dawn, their voices joining in psalms that filled the choir while the world outside still slept. Between the hours of prayer came periods of work that might include the copying of texts when resources permitted, the crafting of vestments or altar cloth through delicate embroidery that combined utility with artistry, or the instruction of young girls sent for education, their presence adding a layer of continuity as novices learned letters alongside the rule of silence and obedience. Meals taken in common refectories emphasise simplicity, often drawn from gardens tended within the enclosure or provisions supplied by dependent tenants. The same careful economies that sustained male monasteries now applied in settings where manual labour for women carried different connotations of humility and separation from worldly concerns. Evenings might bring readings from Scripture or the lives of female saints, moments that reinforced a shared identity, while the community prepared for the night offices that punctuated rest with further calls to vigilance and prayer. Intellectual and artistic contributions of nuns emerged within these constraints, their writings and illuminations sometimes preserved in manuscripts that hint at networks of correspondence reaching across regions, as when figures like Hildegard of Bingen composed visionary works, medical treatises, and liturgical music that drew on both classical learning and personal revelation. The possibility lingers that convents served as centres for the transmission of knowledge among women, their scriptoriums producing psalters or hagiographies that circulated through family connections or pilgrim routes, even as access to the full range of patristic texts remained mediated by male confessors or visiting scholars. Theories among historians suggest that artistic output such as embroidered altar frontals or decorated books of ours reflected not only devotional intent but also a subtle assertion of identity. Their intricate designs incorporating symbols or motifs that spoke to the experiences of enclosed life in ways that parallel yet diverged from the grander productions of monastic scriptoriums elsewhere. In some houses, abbesses maintained libraries or commissioned works that preserved local histories or saints' cults, contributions that added layers to the broader monastic legacy of learning without ever matching the scale of resources available to wealthier male institutions. Challenges unique to female monastics compounded these patterns, their houses frequently smaller and less endowed, reliant on periodic visitations by male clergy, who alone could celebrate Mass or hear confessions, a dependence that introduced vulnerabilities when external authorities sought to impose reforms or redirect revenues. Enclosure, while intended to safeguard spiritual focus, could limit mobility and economic initiative, leaving communities more exposed during times of war, plague, or shifting royal policies that threatened dissolution or absorption into larger male orders. Historians note how abbesses sometimes navigated these waters through kinship networks, securing protections or donations from relatives in ways that paralleled yet remained distinct from the direct political engagements of abbots. Their influence often exercised quietly through counsel or the education of future noblewomen. The records occasionally reveal disputes over jurisdiction or the handling of endowments, moments when the same tensions between renunciation and worldly entanglement that marked male houses appeared in sharper relief for women whose legal standing already placed them at a remove from feudal obligations or royal assemblies. Over centuries, these dynamics invited periodic calls for reform, with some convents adapting through stricter observance, while others faced decline as patronage shifted toward newer foundations or mendicant groups. Such variations across regions and orders underscore how female monasticism developed its own rhythms of continuity and adaptation, the quiet persistence of prayer and work within convent walls offering a counterpoint to the more visible accumulations of power described in male communities. In this interplay of choice and constraint, creativity and limitation, the hidden life of these houses sustained a parallel tradition of devotion that enriched the medieval spiritual landscape while revealing the boundaries that shaped women's participation in the monastic ideal. Yet even as these rhythms of prayer and quiet labour continued to shape lives within the cloister, the late medieval centuries brought subtle shifts that historians still trace through scattered charters and visitation records, hints of strain emerging as populations fluctuated after repeated outbreaks of plague and warfare disrupted the steady flow of donations that had once sustained so many houses. Some communities found their endowments stretched thin when heirs contested wills or when inflation eroded the value of fixed rents from tenant farms, while others faced questions about whether the original ideals of simplicity had given way to more comfortable arrangements, with abbots occasionally drawn into local disputes over land or influence that blurred the line between spiritual detachment and temporal entanglement. Theories among scholars suggest these pressures did not signal outright collapse so much as a gradual adaptation, where certain orders tightened observance in hopes of renewal, while others leaned on older privileges that now invited criticism from reformers both inside and outside the church. The upheavals of the Reformation added another layer of uncertainty, as new theological voices across northern Europe began questioning the very foundations of monastic vows and intercessory prayer, portraying enclosed communities as unnecessary intermediaries rather than essential sanctuaries. In regions where Protestant ideas took hold, monasteries sometimes emptied through voluntary departures or redirected patronage, their buildings repurposed for schools or civic uses in ways that reflected shifting priorities toward direct scripture reading and lay piety. The possibility lingers that these changes unfolded unevenly, with some houses attempting internal reforms to align with evangelical calls for simplicity, while others resisted or adapted by emphasizing education and charity in fresh forms. What remains clear from surviving accounts is how the intellectual and devotional networks once centered in monastic scriptoriums began to fragment, their manuscripts scattered or reinterpreted amid debates that historians continue to explore for signs of continuity rather than total rupture. In England, the process reached a decisive turn under Henry VIII, whose break with Rome opened the door to a systematic survey of monastic wealth that led to the closure of hundreds of institutions between 1536 and 1540. Royal commissioners documented assets ranging from extensive farmlands to libraries and relics, revenues that flowed into the crown's coffers and helped finance military campaigns or reward loyal nobles through grants of former abbey lands. Yet the records also reveal instances of resistance or quiet negotiation, with some communities petitioning for exemptions or smaller houses merging with larger ones in attempts to preserve a remnant of their way of life. Historians weigh the extent to which these dissolutions stemmed purely from financial motives against the backdrop of genuine religious conviction on the king's part, noting how the speed of the process left many buildings abandoned or partially dismantled, their stones later quarried for local construction projects. The human stories embedded in pension lists and relocation documents suggest that monks and nuns often received modest allowances to ease the transition, though the long-term fate of those displaced varied according to family connections or the availability of alternative religious houses abroad. Not every monastery vanished in this wave of change. Across Catholic regions of Europe, communities in Italy, Spain, and parts of the Empire continued their observances with varying degrees of vitality, some evolving into centres of renewed scholarship during the Counter-Reformation, or maintaining agricultural self-sufficiency that buffered them against later political storms. In England itself, a handful of foundations survived in altered form, such as certain cathedrals that retained monastic chapters, or sites like Westminster Abbey that transitioned into collegiate churches. While the majority of rural priories and nunneries fell into ruin, their cloisters overgrown and their libraries dispersed. Theories persist about whether hidden caches of manuscripts or oral traditions preserved fragments of monastic knowledge in unexpected places, from private collections to the margins of Protestant scholarship that drew, sometimes unwittingly, on earlier compilations. These divergent paths remind us that dissolution was never a single event, but a mosaic of local outcomes shaped by geography, patronage, and the unpredictable currents of reform, leaving behind a landscape dotted with both enduring echoes and vanished traces that still invite quiet reflection on how institutions adapt or fade across centuries. Yet as those cloisters fell silent in so many regions and their stones settled into new uses, the quiet patterns they had nurtured did not simply vanish. Instead, they seeped outward, shaping habits of mind and daily life that still echo through the centuries we inhabit. One begins to sense this inheritance in the very notion of structured time that once guided the divine hours, for the careful division of day and night into periods of reflection and labour helped lay the groundwork for later systems of scheduling that underpin everything from academic calendars to the measured pace of modern work weeks. Monastic communities had preserved and copied not only scripture, but countless classical works by authors whose thoughts might otherwise have slipped away, and those same scriptoriums fostered habits of careful transcription and commentary that later fed into the rise of universities and the wider circulation of knowledge during the Renaissance. Agricultural techniques refined within monastery gardens and farms, from selective breeding of livestock to systematic crop rotation and the careful management of water through mills and fish ponds, contributed practical knowledge that passed into secular hands and supported growing populations long after the original brothers had dispersed. Even the earliest forms of organised medical care, with their emphasis on herbal remedies, cleanliness and attentive nursing within infirmaries, offered models that influenced the development of hospitals as places of healing rather than mere shelter. These gifts arrived not as sudden inventions but as gradual accumulations, tested over generations in relative seclusion, and then offered outward when circumstances allowed. Historians continue to trace the precise lines of transmission through surviving account books and estate records, noting how certain innovations travelled via travelling monks or lay servants who carried skills into new settings, while acknowledging that many parallel developments arose independently in lay society as well. In our own time, a number of monastic communities persist, their rhythms adapted yet still recognisable to those who visit or join them for a season. Benedictine houses in Italy, France, and parts of the United States maintain the cycle of prayer and work that St. Benedict outlined, welcoming guests who seek a few days of silence amid the clamour of contemporary existence. Some orders have turned their attention more fully toward education or ecological stewardship, operating schools and sustainable farms that echo the self-sufficiency once practiced behind high walls. In England, a few cathedrals retain chapters of canons whose daily offices continue in spaces once occupied by medieval monks, while across Europe, contemplative communities in Spain and Austria preserve illuminated manuscripts and musical traditions that link present voices to those earlier centuries. Newer expressions appear as well, such as ecumenical retreat centres inspired by monastic principles, yet open to people of varied backgrounds, where the emphasis falls on personal stillness rather than formal vows. Theories among scholars suggest these surviving houses represent both continuity and reinvention, with some drawing explicitly on medieval rules, while others incorporate modern insights into psychology and community life. The possibility remains that such places serve as living laboratories for testing whether ancient balances of solitude and fellowship can still offer stability amid rapid social change. What draws many visitors to these remaining sanctuaries is an enduring appeal that transcends any single religious tradition. The prospect of stepping into an environment where clocks yield to bells, where conversations unfold slowly, and where the same tasks repeat with quiet intention, continues to attract those weary of constant notifications and fragmented attention. One might imagine arriving at such a gate after a long journey, the weight of ordinary concerns loosening as the door closes behind and the scent of stone and beeswax fills the air. Within those hours set aside for reading or walking the grounds, a different measure of time emerges, one that invites noticing small details like the way light shifts across a cloister wall or how a single chant lingers in the rafters. This pull toward monastic peace appears in countless personal accounts across centuries, from medieval pilgrims seeking temporary shelter to contemporary travellers who book brief stays in guest houses attached to active communities. It persists because the underlying human need for intervals of genuine quiet has not diminished, even as the surrounding world grows louder. Scholars exploring these patterns often note that the appeal lies less in any specific doctrine and more in the lived experience of ordered simplicity, an experience that can be tasted without permanent commitment. As we reflect on the centuries we have traversed together through these cloistered stories, certain threads stand out with particular clarity. The monasteries we have considered were never isolated fortresses of unchanging routine, but living experiments in balancing prayer, labour, study and care for others. Experiments whose successes and strains alike left traces in the wider culture. Their libraries safeguarded texts that later generations would build upon. Their farms modelled careful stewardship of land, and their willingness to receive the sick and the traveller-planted seeds for institutions of public welfare that evolved far beyond the original walls. At the same time, the very pressures that led to dissolution remind us how fragile such communities could prove when external demands shifted or internal ideals wavered. What lingers most vividly is the invitation they extended and still extend to pause. Whether one steps into a surviving monastery today, or simply carries a fragment of their measured pace into an ordinary morning, the possibility arises of reclaiming a small measure of that calm corner they once guarded so carefully. In that sense, their legacy is not confined to history books or ruined arches, but remains available whenever we choose to notice the soft grey light at dawn, or let a single hour unfold without hurry. If these reflections have offered a welcome pause in your day, we would be grateful if you would consider liking this video and leaving a comment to share where you are listening from. Should the quiet rhythm of these stories resonate with you, subscribing will bring similar journeys to your feed whenever new chapters are ready. Thank you for spending this time with the hidden life of medieval monasteries.